From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. To the point that Kim was making before the break, I guess this is the enduring mystery of the Biden presidency in my mind, because recall he ran in 2020 as the guy who can unite the country. And shortly then, after securing the Democratic nomination, he started making these gestures to the left, getting together with Bernie Sanders and adopting some talking points from the Sanders agenda, and then coming into office. And part of the calculation there may have been the surprise of taking control of the Senate, swinging for the fences instead of doing what he promised and trying to run an administration up the middle. And so that has been the way that he has governed. But again, I guess the mystery only deepens because here we have polls showing President Biden losing to President Trump in many of these key swing states. And he has no real primary opposition. Dean Phillips took about 20% of the vote in New Hampshire, which I think is an omen of President Biden's weakness, but nobody thinks that Dean Phillips is going to outcompete him for the nomination. And so why is he so constantly worried about these critics on the left? Why does he not make a pitch to the center of the country, look past the Democratic primary, look toward the general election, and think, what do I need to do and what do I need to say to get those voters back in places like Wisconsin and in places like Michigan, in these swing states that I need if I am going to defeat President Trump? And one of those, to my mind, Alicia, could be this changing tactics on energy. And it's similar on oil production. There have been headlines in recent days and in recent months about the United States hitting record oil production. And I don't think that President Biden deserves credit for that. I think that is some recovery from the pandemic, but nothing has ever stopped a president from bragging about something that happens on his watch, whether or not it is a direct result of his policies or unrelated to them. And so, again, I think that it would be wise politically for President Biden to come out and say, look at this. We are hitting record oil production. I'm going to approve these liquid natural gas facilities. We're going to keep drilling. We're going to keep energy costs down. But Alicia, I think that would be a very popular message with the broader electorate that President Biden needs.
Last year, the U.S. hit a record oil production. And the administration was a little embarrassed about it, especially when it was going to the COP28 conference in Dubai. It was a little bit on the back foot and had to apologize for its emissions, even though actually, by the way, U.S. emissions declined by the equivalent of about 40 million cars on the road. And that was mostly because of natural gas displacing coal, as an aside. But the president, you haven't heard him go out and basically boast about all the benefits of natural gas in terms of benefits, national security benefits. I have some quotes actually somebody sent me from back when he was vice president, when he actually was doing that. He said this at a Caribbean Energy Security Initiative. We have technologies in natural gas that are moving forward, and we should expect this to be a panacea for everyone. But it's also true that there are more options at your disposal now for natural gas delivery than there have ever been, from small-scale barge trades of LNG to floating import terminals. And these aren't just designs on paper. They exist. They operate. And then he goes on to talk about LNG exporters with licenses. And if you want gas, go talk to them. And he was actually very supportive of LNG in the natural gas industry. And not surprising, because you recall, he very much, in 2020 actually, campaigned. He declined to say that he wouldn't ban fracking at one point, but he was very much, tried to be kind of like the candidate for the quote unquote working class. And that's kind of how he has been perceived by a lot of Democrats. But right now, I think the problem is he's just afraid of the left flank of his party. And that goes beyond climate. It also extends to immigration, a lot of the diversity stuff, the stuff that's going on in higher education. He really just doesn't want to anger the left flank. And I think that just speaks to his weakness as a politician, as a leader. So I don't think this is necessarily a problem that's isolated to climate. I think it extends across the administration, that he's just lacks a backbone.
But the point about natural gas displacing coal and other fuels and actually lowering emissions is the other piece of this debate that I find frustrating, Kim. And I would point to an op-ed in the Journal by Jeffrey Kupfer. The headline is "An LNG export ban is bad politics for Biden." And here is a piece of the argument. He says, natural gas is a cleaner alternative to coal, biomass, and wood. With roughly half the carbon dioxide emissions of coal, U.S. LNG exports to Asia have displaced vast quantities of coal in some of the world's fastest growing economies, a big step toward reducing global emissions, unquote. And so, Kim, if the intent here is to focus on emissions and evaluate these LNG export projects as emissions drivers, it seems to me that President Biden would be well placed to make the opposite argument, to say what we are doing by exporting this LNG is displacing coal plants and in some cases cutting in half the emissions that would otherwise be produced if the U.S. were not exporting this natural gas. And I understand that there is a flank on the progressive climate wing that wants to keep all fossil fuels in the ground and would reject that argument. But if you had a Democratic president that were out there making that case repeatedly, saying that U.S. natural gas has helped the United States lower its own emissions, and now we are going to move forward, and while creating these jobs in the American economy, we're going to help other countries lower their own emissions by giving them the same tool that we have used here. I think you could get many Democratic voters, many progressive voters on board with that story, while again, still pitching toward the middle in a way that would help President Biden in November.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. Alicia was just talking about the United States' own progress in reducing its emissions. But as we constantly talk about here in the context of climate and international climate deals, the issue isn't us. The issue is the rest of the world. It's developing economies, in particular China, which has hundreds of coal plants that are going to be coming online. And to the extent that we can export a cleaner energy that displaces some of that, in particular in countries like Asia, which are very coal dependent, and we are already doing that. We're sending LNG exports, and they are using it to replace what would otherwise be dirtier emitting fuels. To the extent we can do that, then we're beginning to address some of the questions about global emissions, which are what really mattered, okay? We don't live in a little isolated part of just North America that you can put a bubble over and say, hey, look how great our emissions are. We live on a planet, as the left never ceases to remind us, and that climate change is global. So we have to care about that. And interestingly, we did have a Democratic president who initially came to office and made that argument, and his name was Barack Obama. And for a number of years, even the environmental community, the reasonable environmental community, was on that page. Remember the good old days when we all talked about natural gas being a bridge fuel? There was an understanding that it would be decades before we reached any even start of a conceivable moment at which we could rely in any significant way more on renewable energies like solar and wind, etc. And that this was going to be the cleanest way to get us there, far cleaner than anything we were using. And then that was when the more militant wing on the environmental left began attacking Obama over some of their initial LNG export permits, over the Keystone Pipeline. This was all happening as Obama was gearing up for re-election. And because of the sensitivity to that complaint among the base, he really did a 180 on this. And it's gone downhill from there, to the extent that you had Joe Biden, even as he was running for office, was promising he was going to keep it all in the ground and stop drilling. And the president, as you alluded to, Kyle, he's benefited from this, again, mostly from a lot of efficiency gains that have been made in the private industry on areas like the Permian Basin in Texas. But he's still so incredibly wary of offending his left. He's throwing aside all the good political upsides and arguments like the one you just made in favor of catering to a very small minority.
Hang tight. We'll be right back after one more break. Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. To sum this up as we bring this episode to a close, Alicia, I guess I wonder if gesture politics is the right way to think about this. And I would compare it to a similar decision, at least it looks that way to me, which is the pulling of the permits for the Keystone XL Pipeline. That was another project where it seems to me it was good for the economy. Canceling it was not really going to have any appreciable climate benefit. And in terms of international relations, you want to be good neighbors and good allies to Canada. And again, to make the comparison, these countries in Europe or Asia that we're exporting natural gas to. And yet that project became a cause célèbre on the left. And the response to that by the president was to cater to that faction and do the kind of gesture politics that gets him happy tweets and yet is wrong on the merits if you take a look at them. And Alicia, I don't know what that says about today's politics, that's where we are. But to me, this decision on the exporting of natural gas is a similar dynamic.
I think it's actually would be more even destructive than the Keystone XL Pipeline veto. The oil from Canada is still getting out. It's just moving by train, or essentially, in some cases, it's going west or east on Canadian pipeline. So it really didn't have much of a difference. A ban on LNG exports, however, would have an appreciable impact in terms of reducing the global supply and giving an advantage to Russia, which, by the way, is expanding its own LNG exports. It would also give a boost to Iran, which is also working on its own LNG facility that it hopes to have online in the next year or so. So actually, this would have a much bigger or more damaging impact than the veto of the XL pipeline. And to your point about the gesture politics, you could argue that's on both sides. The whole idea of a border wall, that's very much a political gesture. You don't really need to build a wall across the border to secure the border, but it has become kind of a rallying cry on the right. And so in some ways, this is something that the LNG exports, which is kind of strange because it never used to be a rallying cry. It has now become so, in part because you have a lot of these activists drumming up and whipping people up on social media. One of the places where this has really taken off is TikTok, by the way, where you have these activists who've gotten millions of views on these viral videos condemning LNG exports. And this also raises questions in my mind, to what extent are the Chinese fueling this? Much like the Russians kind of covertly aided groups opposing fracking in Europe, to what extent are the Chinese through the TikTok, because you saw this also, by the way, with the Willow Oil project, also opposition was very strong on TikTok platform. To what extent the Chinese are contributing to this, because they know LNG would be a geopolitical benefit to the U.S., but also the West. And so I think that's something actually worth investigating if Congress could.
Thank you, Alicia and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.